My husband of 12 years was standing in our grand mahogany foyer, holding an unsigned surrender of parental rights, while my mother-in-law calmly packed my daughter's favorite stuffed rabbit into a leather briefcase. The local sheriff was standing on our front porch with a federal warrant bearing my signature on documents I had never seen in my life. I was being arrested for a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme from my late father's commercial real estate firm, a business I had built into an empire alongside the very man who was now refusing to look me in the eye. They had spent 6 months meticulously replacing my real signatures with forged digital mandates, shifting untaxed money through offshore accounts to finance their covert expansion in Chicago, while leaving a clear paper trail leading directly to my personal bank account. As the cold metal of the handcuffs locked around my wrists, my mother-in-law leaned down to whisper in my ear that a convicted felon would never see a single dime of the family trust or regain custody of a child. I realized in that precise second that every act of kindness, every quiet compromise, and every sacrifice I had made for this family over the last decade had been calculated as a stepping stone toward my complete ruin. As the police car pulled away down the driveway of the estate my inheritance had paid for, I looked back to see my husband uncorking a bottle of vintage champagne on the porch. The story of my downfall began long before the federal agents arrived at my door, wrapped in the quiet, insidious way bad intentions disguise themselves as unconditional love. When I inherited Miller Commercial Holdings from my father 12 years ago, it was a solid regional real estate firm with modest debt and an impeccable reputation across Pennsylvania. I was 26, grieving the sudden loss of the only parent I had ever known, and wholly unprepared for the crushing weight of running an enterprise worth tens of millions. Enter Julian Vance, a brilliant financial analyst, with an effortless smile and an uncanny ability to make me feel safe when the world felt entirely too big. We were married within 18 months of my father's funeral, a lavish ceremony paid for by my family estate, held on the sprawling grounds of the historic farm country property that had been in the Miller family for 4 generations. From the very beginning, Julian's mother, Evelyn, positioned herself as the matriarchal anchor I so desperately lacked. She moved into the guest house on our estate within the first year of our marriage, subtly asserting her presence into every corner of our daily lives. At first, her interference looked like devotion. She took over the management of the household staff, organized our social calendar, and insisted on managing the trust details when our daughter, Maya, was born 4 years later. I was consumed with expanding my father's legacy, spending 60 hours a week negotiating commercial leases and acquiring prime downtown properties. I considered myself extraordinarily fortunate to have a husband who stepped in as the chief financial officer of Miller Commercial Holdings and a mother-in-law who filled the maternal void in my life. I trusted them implicitly, signing corporate filings, quarterly tax returns, and investment requisitions whenever Julian placed them on my desk during our rushed morning coffees. The subtle shifts in our dynamic began 3 years ago, shortly after Julian suggested we create a secondary asset management branch named Vance and Miller Development. He argued that branching into high-rise residential projects in Chicago would elevate our portfolio and secure Maya's financial future for generations. It sounded visioned and ambitious, and because I loved my husband, I backed the initiative completely, pledging several of my father's unencumbered commercial properties as collateral for corporate credit lines. What I did not know was that the real power structure within my own company had already begun to turn against me. Evelyn started spending long weeks in Chicago, ostensibly overseeing the interior design of the new luxury high-rises we were allegedly building. Meanwhile, back home, small irregularities began to surface in our local accounting records. Petty cash accounts ran dry without explanation. Property tax notices for our prime retail locations arrived with overdue penalties, and Julian began insisting that we consolidate all accounting operations under a private third-party software system to which only he and his senior analyst had administrative access. Whenever I asked to review the balance sheets, Julian would laugh, kiss my forehead, and tell me that I was overworking myself, reminding me that my job was the big picture strategy while his job was taking care of the boring numbers. The turning point came 6 months ago during a routine audit for a routine property refinance. Our longtime family attorney, Arthur Pendleton, called my private cell phone late on a Tuesday evening, his voice trembling with an anxiety I had never heard in his 30 years of service to my family. He told me that several major wire transfers totaling over $4 million had been executed from our core reserve account to an offshore entity registered in the Cayman Islands under the corporate title MV Holdings. Arthur noted that every single electronic authorization form carried my unique encrypted digital signature, logged from my personal laptop during hours when I was routinely out of the office attending regional planning committee meetings. When I confronted Julian that night in our study, he did not panic. Instead, he pulled me into his arms, rubbed my back, and explained with smooth persuasion that MV Holdings was merely a shell entity designed to protect our liquid cash from aggressive corporate tax brackets while we finalized the acquisition of the Chicago waterfront tower. He claimed that he had used my digital signature because I was in meetings and the funding deadlines were strict, reassuring me that every penny was safe and accounted for in our master ledger. I wanted so desperately to believe him that I allowed his rationalizations to silence the alarms blaring in my mind. Yet the atmosphere in our home changed dramatically after that night. Evelyn began treating me not as a beloved daughter-in-law, but as an unstable tenant in my own home. She began making subtle comments in front of our household staff and Maya's nanny about my supposed forgetfulness, frequently asking if I had taken my medication or if I remembered where I had left my car keys. Packages I never ordered began arriving at the house, containing prescription-strength sedatives prescribed to my name by a doctor I had never visited. When I found those pill bottles hidden in the back of my bathroom vanity, a cold drop of sweat rolled down my spine. They were not just taking my money, they were meticulously constructing a narrative of a mentally fragile, financially irresponsible woman who was losing her grip on reality. 3 weeks before my arrest, I took a late-night trip to the office to retrieve files for an upcoming city zoning hearing. The building was completely dark, except for the light spilling from Julian's corner office on the top floor. As I approached the heavy oak doors, I heard Evelyn's sharp, decisive voice through the cracked frame. She was discussing the final transfer of the estate's primary land title, the very property our home sat on, into a newly formed trust that excluded my name entirely. Julian's reply was cold, precise, and devoid of any affection he had shown me over 12 years of marriage. He told his mother that once the final federal audit was triggered by the anonymous tip he had scheduled for the following Monday, the paper trail of forged authorizations would permanently lock me away, leaving him with sole guardianship of Maya and total control of the Miller estate without the messy public battle of a contested divorce. Standing in the carpeted hallway of the company my father built, clutching a stack of zoning maps, I felt the world tilt beneath my feet as the horrific scope of their betrayal slammed into my chest. I did not run into the room. I did not scream, confront them, or give them the satisfaction of knowing their carefully executed trap had been exposed before they were ready to spring it. Instead, I backed away down the silent, carpeted hallway of Miller Commercial Holdings, stepped into the private elevator, and walked out into the cool night air. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition of my car, but inside my mind, a crystal clarity took hold. For 12 years I had been the trusting wife, the dutiful daughter-in-law, the woman who stepped back to let her husband shine. That woman died in the dark hallway outside Julian's office. The next morning I began my own silent counter-operation. I knew that trying to cancel the forged digital signatures or firing Julian outright would instantly trigger their trap before I had secured proof of my own innocence. I needed original documents, hard drives, and untainted banking records that proved the digital signatures were applied remotely while I was nowhere near the network. I quietly hired Richard Vance, no relation to Julian, but a sharp, ruthless forensic accountant based out of Philadelphia, and gave him encrypted remote access to my personal devices and the legacy servers my father had set up years ago, servers Julian had forgotten even existed. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard uncovered the full scope of their conspiracy. Julian had not just diverted $4 million, he had systematically hollowed out Miller Commercial Holdings over 5 years, leveraging company properties to secure massive private loans that were immediately funneled into shell companies controlled by Evelyn in the Cayman Islands and Delaware. The Chicago residential project was a ghost project, a paper illusion built entirely to absorb fake expenditures and wash the stolen capital. Most terrifying of all, Richard found the exact digital footprint proving that the anonymous whistleblower report sent to the Department of Justice had been transmitted directly from Julian's personal laptop, using a private VPN logged into our home Wi-Fi while I was attending an out-of-town charity gala. They had framed me down to the minute, but they had made one fatal mistake born of their own arrogance. They assumed I was as financially naive as I was trusting. They forgot that long before Julian ever touched our balance sheets, my father had spent a decade teaching me the intricacies of commercial contract law, asset structuring, and corporate liability. 3 days before the federal arrest took place, I made a quiet visit to Arthur Pendleton's office. The old family lawyer broke down in tears when I showed him the forensic audit proving Julian's forgery and Evelyn's offshore accounts. Together, we executed a series of legal maneuvers in complete secrecy. First, I invoked an endowment clause in my father's original corporate charter that automatically stripped executive power from any officer attempting to transfer core real estate assets without the unanimous vote of the founding trust. Second, I quietly executed an irrevocable conditional trust for my daughter Maya, transferring ownership of the family's historic estate and all personal heirlooms directly to her, naming Arthur and an independent bank as sole co-trustees in the event of my legal incapacitation. When the federal agents finally arrived at my home that dreadful morning, holding the arrest warrant that Julian and Evelyn had engineered, I did not fight. I let them put the handcuffs on me. I let Evelyn whisper her venomous threats into my ear about taking my child and my father's legacy. I let Julian put on his performance of the grieving, betrayed husband for the local news cameras that had conveniently been tipped off to witness my arrest. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to Betrayed, the Revenge channel. A simple like helps more people discover these stories, and your support inspires us to create new ones. Now, let's continue. I spent 48 hours in federal custody before my bail hearing. During those 48 hours, Julian and Evelyn moved with breathtaking speed to execute the final phase of their plan. Thinking I was broken, disgraced, and facing decades in federal prison, Julian filed an emergency petition for sole temporary custody of Maya and petitioned the court to freeze all my personal assets, claiming I was a flight risk who had squandered the family fortune. Evelyn took up permanent residence in the main mansion, locking my personal belongings in the basement and preparing to put the property on the market to settle what she claimed were my vast corporate debts. What they did not know was that my stay in detention was part of the plan. While they were busy celebrating their apparent victory and filing public documents to claim control of Miller Commercial Holdings, Richard Vance and Arthur Pendleton were submitting our 300-page forensic report directly to the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. On the morning of my bail hearing, the federal courtroom was packed with local press, family acquaintances, and Julian sitting on the front bench with his mother, both wearing pristine black attire and looks of solemn sorrow. Julian had brought his high-priced criminal defense lawyer, ready to present me to the judge as an unhinged, fraudulent wife who had stolen millions from her own family business. When the judge took the bench, my attorney stood up, but not to plead for low bail. Instead, he handed the judge a certified federal injunction issued just 2 hours prior by the senior district judge of the Federal Financial Crimes Division. The courtroom fell dead silent as my lawyer began to read the findings of the federal forensic investigation. He detailed every single IP address, every forged digital certificate traced back to Julian's personal computer, Every wire transfer authorized by Evelyn's offshore shell corporations and the original server logs proving I was 200 miles away when the fraudulent transactions took place. I turned around from the defense table to look directly at Julian. The color had completely drained from his face. Beside him, Evelyn was clutching her pearl necklace, her hands shaking as two plainclothes federal marshals quietly stepped into the back of the courtroom and positioned themselves directly behind their bench. The look of pure horror on Julian's face was worth every second I had spent sitting in a cold holding cell. He tried to stand, his mouth opening to utter some practiced excuse to his high-priced attorney, but the federal marshals moved with swift, practiced precision. Before the local press could even process what was happening, the cuffs were clicked around Julian's wrists, and Evelyn was being escorted out of the gallery in tears, her arrogant composure completely shattered. The judge granted my immediate release, dismissing all provisional charges against me with prejudice, while the federal prosecutor unsealed a sweeping federal indictment against Julian and Evelyn for bank fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. I walked out of that courthouse an innocent woman, the flashbulbs of the local media blinding me as Arthur Pendleton shielded me toward his car. But as we drove away from the courthouse, I did not celebrate. I knew that arresting them was only the first step. Julian and Evelyn were manipulative, resourceful, and desperate, and a wounded snake is always the most dangerous. The real war began 48 hours after their arrest, when Julian's high-powered defense team managed to secure their temporary release on a massive $2 million bond, using corporate assets they still believed they controlled as collateral. The moment Julian stepped out of jail, he launched a scorched earth campaign. Knowing that the criminal case against him would take months to reach trial, he attempted to freeze every operational bank account of Miller Commercial Holdings, claiming in civil court that the company was hopelessly insolvent due to corporate mismanagement. He was trying to starve me out, hoping the financial pressure would force me into negotiating a quiet settlement that would drop the criminal charges. He had no idea that I was 3 steps ahead of him. The moment I had returned to my office, I activated the dormant charter clause my father had created decades ago. Because Julian had attempted to transfer land titles without unanimous board consent, his status as chief financial officer had been automatically terminated the moment the federal indictment was unsealed. I immediately revoked his corporate access, froze his company accounts, and initiated a complete lockout of the corporate headquarters. However, Julian had an ace up his sleeve that I hadn't anticipated. 2 days after his release on bail, I received an emergency court summons. Julian had filed an ex parte petition in family court, claiming that my recent arrest in the chaotic financial scandal made me an unfit mother. He had hired a team of psychological experts who presented fabricated diary entries and altered medical records to argue that I suffered from severe emotional instability. The family court judge, acting with extreme caution given the high-profile media circus surrounding our name, issued a temporary order granting Julian exclusive residential custody of Maya at a rented estate while restricting my visitation to supervised hours at a county facility. When the deputy sheriff arrived at my home to execute the temporary custody transfer, my heart was ripped out of my chest. Watching Maya sob in the back of Julian's car as he drove away with a subtle, triumphant smirk on his face was the single most painful moment of my life. He thought he had found my ultimate vulnerability. He thought that by taking my daughter, he could break my resolve and force me to sign over the legacy real estate portfolio in exchange for shared custody. He underestimated how far a mother will go to protect her child and her father's legacy. I did not fall apart. I called my forensic team and Arthur back to my office that very night. We knew that Julian's sudden ability to pay a $2 million cash bond and hire top-tier defense attorneys meant he had access to hidden capital we hadn't yet uncovered. The $4 million shifted to the Cayman Islands was only a fraction of what he had stolen. Richard Vance spent 72 continuous hours digging through the secondary layer of shell accounts. That was when we discovered the first massive plot twist. The Cayman Islands accounts were not owned by Evelyn or Julian at all. They were registered under a third-party corporate entity located in Zurich, Switzerland, owned by none other than my late father's former executive partner, Marcus Sterling, a man who had retired 10 years ago after a fierce legal battle with my father over company shares. Julian hadn't just been stealing money for himself and his mother. He had been working as an insider operative for Marcus Sterling from the very day he met me 12 years ago. Our entire marriage, from our romantic meeting at a real estate seminar to the birth of our daughter, had been a long, calculated corporate espionage campaign orchestrated by my father's oldest enemy to dismantle Miller Commercial Holdings from the inside out and reclaim the multi-million-dollar land assets my father had secured. The realization hit me like a physical blow. 12 years of my life, every memory, every kiss, every shared laugh had been built on a manufactured lie designed to destroy me. But the shock quickly turned into a cold, lethal focus. Julian thought he was playing chess with an emotional, desperate woman. He didn't know I had just discovered the master hand behind his entire life. I immediately launched my counterstrike, but I didn't target Julian first. I targeted Marcus Sterling. Using our forensic proof of the Swiss transfers, Arthur filed an emergency petition with the International Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, flagging Sterling's corporate accounts for money laundering and international wire fraud. Within 48 hours, the Swiss authorities froze all accounts associated with Sterling's firm, completely cutting off Julian's financial pipeline. The money Julian was using to pay his criminal defense lawyers and his family law attorneys vanished overnight. Deprived of his financial lifeline, Julian panicked. He knew that without funding, his legal team would withdraw, and the criminal charges against him would lead straight to a federal prison sentence. In his desperation, he made a fatal error. He called an emergency meeting with me at our old corporate office after hours, claiming he wanted to negotiate a full surrender of child custody and return all stolen assets if I agreed to drop the civil lawsuits and testify as a character witness to lessen his federal charges. I agreed to meet him, but I did not go alone. I alerted the federal marshals and the lead prosecutor on our financial crimes case, equipping myself with a covert wire approved under a federal assistance mandate. When I entered the darkened conference room of Miller Commercial Holdings, Julian was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a thick leather folder. He looked hollow, aged by 10 years in a matter of weeks, his arrogant demeanor replaced by an edge of wild desperation. He held out the folder, offering to sign full custody of Maya over to me immediately in exchange for my signature on a global liability release. It was then that I dropped the second major twist on him. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I already knew about Marcus Sterling, the Swiss accounts, and the 12-year plan to dismantle my father's company. Julian's face went dead white, but instead of breaking down, he let out a bitter, desperate laugh. He leaned across the table and revealed his own shocking final play. He told me that even if he went to prison, it wouldn't matter, because 3 days prior, using the temporary parental authority granted by the family court, he had placed all of Maya's trust assets and the deeds to the historic family estate into an irrevocable offshore trust controlled by Marcus Sterling's foreign holding firm. He smugly informed me that because the trust was registered in an offshore jurisdiction that did not recognize U.S. civil judgments, the land my family had owned for 4 generations now belonged to Sterling, and I would spend the rest of my life penniless, fighting an endless international legal battle just to keep a roof over my child's head. He looked at me with pure malice, believing he had delivered the ultimate death blow to my life and my family legacy. He thought he had trapped me forever in an unwinnable nightmare. I did not blink, I did not scream, and I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing a single tear fall from my eye. Instead, I pulled a crisp, white envelope from my coat pocket and placed it quietly on the polished mahogany table between us. Julian glanced at the envelope with a dismissive sneer, believing it was nothing more than a desperate counter-proposal. But as I slid it closer to him, his eyes caught the official seal of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania Appellate Court stamped across the top. What Julian's arrogance had blinded him to was the foundational law governing family trusts in our state. 2 days before he attempted to transfer Maya's trust assets to Marcus Sterling's foreign holding firm, Arthur Pendleton and I had already filed a secret petition to execute the conditional clause my father had embedded in the original charter 4 decades ago. That clause stipulated that any attempt by a non-lineal trustee to transfer minor beneficiary assets out of state would trigger an immediate automatic reversion of all titles directly back to the primary founding trust, under the sole, unassailable stewardship of the founding family member, me. The temporary family court order Julian had manipulated only gave him personal custody of Maya. It never gave him legal authority over the founding trust's capital. The document he had signed with Marcus Sterling was not a multi-million-dollar land transfer. It was a legally binding confession of fraudulent conveyance and attempted theft of a minor's trust funds. By trying to sell my daughter's heritage out from under her, Julian had personally executed a felony transaction on federal wire networks. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. The color drained from his skin, leaving him gray and hollow under the fluorescent lights of the conference room. He grabbed the paper, his hands trembling so violently that he tore the corner of the envelope as he read the appellate ruling. The foreign holding firm had received nothing but invalid titles, and the federal prosecutor listening to our conversation through my hidden wire had just recorded every single word of his confession. The heavy double doors of the conference room burst open. 4 armed federal marshals stepped into the room, followed immediately by the lead federal prosecutor and 2 local law enforcement officers. Before Julian could even utter a word, he was forced down onto the mahogany table, his wrists brought behind his back as the metal cuffs snapped shut around his wrists for the second, final time. As they pulled him upright, he looked at me, not with anger, but with a terrifying, helpless realization. The quiet, trusting woman he thought he had married 12 years ago had maneuvered him into a legal enclosure from which there was no escape. He tried to speak, to offer some pathetic apology, but I simply turned my back on him and walked out into the corridor. Outside the corporate building, another team of marshals was executing a federal search warrant on the guest house where Evelyn was attempting to shred financial documents. I stood on the front lawn of my estate, watching as agents carried out boxes of files, hard drives, and offshore account ledgers. Evelyn was led out to a police cruiser, her designer clothes rumpled, screaming threats into the empty night air that nobody was listening to anymore. Within 48 hours, the full house of cards collapsed entirely. Faced with undeniable forensic evidence, recorded confessions, and the total freezing of his foreign assets, Marcus Sterling turned on Julian to save himself, handing over 10 years of encrypted emails and wire records that detailed every aspect of their conspiracy. The U.S. Attorney's Office filed upgraded charges including racketeering, grand larceny, and corporate sabotage against all 3 conspirators. Julian was sentenced to 18 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Evelyn, convicted as an active co-conspirator in wire fraud and identity theft, received a 7-year sentence. Marcus Sterling's entire corporate empire was dismantled through federal asset forfeiture, with tens of millions in restitution ordered to be paid directly back to Miller Commercial Holdings. The family court immediately terminated Julian's parental rights, restoring full, sole legal and physical custody of Maya to me. The day I picked my daughter up from the temporary care facility and brought her home to our historic estate was the day the air finally felt clear again. I spent the next 6 months doing the slow, meticulous work of cleaning up the damage they had left behind. I restructured Miller Commercial Holdings from top to bottom, cutting away every toxic tie, liquidating the fake ventures in Chicago, and re-establishing the rock-solid integrity my father had spent his entire life building. Every employee who had been manipulated or pushed out by Julian was brought back with full back pay and promotions. Revenge, I realized, was not about watching Julian and Evelyn rot in a prison cell, though justice demanded they serve every single day of their sentences. True revenge was reclaiming my name, my father's legacy, and my daughter's future from the hands of people who believed I was too weak to defend them. It was standing in the foyer where they had once put handcuffs on me, knowing that every inch of this land, every stone of this home, and every contract with my signature on it was completely, undeniably mine. I walked out onto the porch with a warm cup of coffee in my hands, listening to the sound of Maya's laughter echoing from the gardens, where she played safely under the morning sun. The painful chapter of my life had closed, not with a tragic ending, but with the quiet, unbreakable strength of a woman who had finally stepped into her own power. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe to Betrayed, the Revenge channel. New video coming soon.